Hello, YouTube divers. This is WaterDive122, and I want to welcome you all back to yet another episode of Magic Metal Mondays. And today I wanted to do something a little bit differently. This time I'm going to be ranking albums from a certain type of music genre. So today I decided to do my personal favorite music genre of all time, and that is the genre of metal, any type of metal, specifically power metal, classic heavy metal, thrash metal. It doesn't matter. Um, Now I know in the past I've made a top 10 albums list. Some of the bands that were on that list will not be featured here because this list is only focusing on metal. So there won't be any Pink Floyd, there won't be any Yes, there won't be any Rush because they're progressive hard rock. Um, there will be and even bands like Green Day or Breaking Benjamin, those bands won't be on this list mainly because they're a little bit more of a punk type of vibe. Although you could argue that Breaking Benjamin's a heavy metal band or whatever you want to call them. But yeah, I will like in my top 10 albums of all time. I will leave honorable mentions down in the description below. And as always, I'm really happy to hear y'all's opinion down in the comments. So you can type those up if you want to. But keep in mind, this is just my opinion, and these are all easily recognizable albums that a lot of folks out there have heard. This is my top 10. And so let's get started. Okay, so the bottom half of this list was very hard for me to rank because the top 5 was easy. But the first 5 were definitely the hardest. And these were all albums that appeared in my honorable mention section for my top 10 albums video that I did. But I decided coming in at number 10 is the 1990 Pantera album, Cowboys from Hell. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not the biggest Pantera fan in the world, although Dimebag Darrell is one of my favorite metal guitar players. This is definitely the album where Phil Anselmo decides to sing a little bit, if you even want to classify it as that, because on the albums that came after this album, which are Vulgar Display of Power and of course Far Beyond Driven, he uses like a little bit of a death metal type of vibe. He uses like black metal techniques, death metal techniques. I'm just not a fan of that kind of music. But on Cowboys from Hell, he definitely decides to sing a lot. The title track is freaking killer, one of the best Pantera riffs of all time. Cemetery Gates is another classic on here. And yeah, I mean, as I said, the aforementioned Cemetery Gates, beautiful, beautiful ballad. Absolutely love it to death. And, crap, there's a lot of other great songs on here. This is a classic album for sure. If you like this type of music, if you like extreme metal, I suggest you give this album a listen because, this album is just a fun roller coaster of a ride. I will say that. Now, number 9 might be a little bit of a controversial pick because this band is not really technically metal, but in my opinion, this is a metal album. We're talking about Def Leppard's Pyromania from 1983. So, this is really the only metal album that Def Leppard ever did. It has some classic songs on here like Rock of Ages and of course the classic Photograph. And a spoiler alert, that was actually the song that got me into Def Leppard. Let me see. I think Rocket might be on this album. I could be wrong. But a lot of the songs that Def Leppard played for their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction was off of this album. And of course, the 1987 album Hysteria, which is one of my top 10 favorite one of my top 5 favorite albums from 1987. For sure. I mean, in my opinion, this album doesn't really have any bad songs on this. I mean, of course, you got Photograph and freaking Rock of Ages, and I think Rocket might be off of this one too. Women, the song Women might be off of this. I also could be wrong about that. It's been a while since I've listened to Pyromania, but, you know, it's a freaking classic. And it's obviously my favorite Def Leppard album, and it would definitely be a lot of people's favorite Def Leppard album, in my opinion. And pretty much folks could actually agree on that. And speaking of 1987, we have an album from 1987 that appears on this list, coming in at number 8. We're talking about Guns N' Roses' very own Appetite for Destruction. Now, this was the debut album for Guns N' Roses and the only album to feature the classic lineup of Guns N' Roses. And I know I lecture about debut albums, but I can make a huge exception on this album. This album is perfect. I mean, this is just a classic hair metal album, if you even want to call it that. Hard rock, something like that. But that opening riff on Sweet Child of Mine, I know a lot of people have said this already, and I'll say it again. It just never gets out of your head. And fun fact, for those of you who don't know, that opening riff on Sweet Child of Mine was actually a warm-up that Slash, the guitar player for Guns N' Roses, actually did time and time again, and they used it to make that classic song. I mean, Welcome to the Jungle is a great song. I heard it on the radio earlier this afternoon. Killer. Paradise City is another great song on here. Basically, the three-headed monster that is Sweet Child of Mine, Welcome to the Jungle, and Paradise City. That rounds off this late 80s masterpiece. This album is just freaking killer, and I gotta say, this is one of the best debut albums of all time. No question. Now, coming in at number 7? Okay, so number 7, we're talking about Sabbath Bloody Sabbath by Black Sabbath from 1973. I remember one night I was doing the dishes and I was listening to this album and I was just so amazed because I've already heard the title track of this album numerous times. Ozzy Osbourne sounds absolutely amazing on this album. I believe Tony Iommi is at his, not really his prime, because on the previous album, Volume 4, and on the follow-up, Sabotage, he does express a lot of his guitar skills a lot more, but on this album, especially on the title track and on Sabracadabra, he definitely shows off what he can do in his heavier tones. And it basically kind of gives you a lot of Children of the Grave vibes from the Master of the Reality album that they did 2 years earlier than this album. But this is a stone cold classic Black Sabbath album, and it's one of the most important metal albums in my opinion. And for that, I just can't help but love it. Ozzy Osbourne is at his peak here. Geezer Butler kills it on the bass. As I said, Tony Iommi kills it on guitar, and of course, I think Bill Ward was the drummer off of this on this album. Yeah, I think he was. He does a really good job on this album. I love this album. Freaking amazing. But it falls here at number 7. Because these next albums are, in my opinion, better than this. Now we get to number 6. We're talking about the 1984 Iron Maiden album, Power Slave. How could I not have this album in my top 10? This album is way more interesting than The Number of the Beast, in my opinion, even though The Number of the Beast does have stronger songs overall, if you want to call it that. And Peace of Mind it smokes Peace of Mind, in my opinion, even though Peace of Mind is a really good album by Iron Maiden. Heck, it has The Trooper. On this album, Bruce Dickinson shows off his vocal abilities to his fullest extent. You put the freaking needle down, and then it opens up with an Iron Maiden classic, which is Aces High, my favorite song off the album. What an opener. Then it follows it up with the classic 2 Minutes to Midnight. Back in the Village is also a great song off of this album. The title track is also really good. And of course, the frickin' 13-minute epic, that is the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, this is probably one of my top 5 all-time. This is probably in my top 5 all-time favorite metal epics. Because, there would be a lot of metal epics on that list, from bands like Halloween and stuff like that. But this album just never gets old. And, Bruce Dickinson kills it. Adrian Smith and Neil Murray, I believe those were Maiden's 2 guitar players. I could be wrong. They kill it on this album. Stephen Harris does a great job on the bass, especially on Aces High. And Nico McBrien absolutely kills it on the drums. This is a killer album, and I think it's way better than the first 2 albums they did with Dickinson, which were Number of the Beast and Peace of Mind. But that's just my opinion. Power Slave here at number 6. Now, because I've already told you deeply about my top 5 albums, like in previous videos, I'll just be brief with them here. Number 5, the 1985 Anthrax album, Spreading the Disease. I've talked about this album in 2 different videos, my top 10 albums video, and of course my previous Magic Metal Mondays video when I ranked Anthrax's albums. I will just go so far to say that AIR, phenomenal opener. Madhouse is another stone cold classic on here. And of course Medusa is my favorite song on the album, and it's probably my favorite Anthrax song. Absolutely kills it. Joey Belladonna does an amazing job on vocalist. Dan Spitz and Scott Ian do an amazing job dueling it out on the guitars. Frank Bello also making his debut with Anthrax. Absolutely killer. And of course, frickin' Charlie Benante on the drums. He frickin' kills it, especially on songs like AIR and of course Madhouse. Spreading the Disease, stone cold classic from Anthrax. And I wish that their follow-up, Among the Living, was a little bit like this, even though Among the Living is definitely a freaking classic by Anthrax. And even though Among the Living does have stronger songs overall, I guess, I don't know. I'm getting off track here. So number 5, Spreading the Disease by Anthrax. And now we come into number 4, which is the 1986 Slayer album, Rain and Blood. Now, like with Spreading the Disease, I've talked about this album in previous videos. But I remember this album is just freaking insane. And maybe that's what I love about it. I mean, it starts off with freaking Angel of Death. As I said numerous times, it's one of the best thrash metal openers. And of course, Raining Blood, one of the best album closures. And of course, you have Altar of Sacrifice and Necrophobic. 2 other stone cold, bad to the bone songs off of this classic thrash metal album. Jesus Saves is a great song. There's really not much, and of course Criminally Frickin' Insane. There's really not much to complain about Rain and Blood. And yeah, I mean, Slayer released a lot of other great albums, but for me, this one is just perfect. It's not too long. It just shows off Slayer at their best. Tom Araya does a freaking killer job on this album, as does the late Jeff Hanneman, and of course the present day Kerry King, and of course Dave, the godfather of the double bass drum pedal, Lombardo, on the freaking drums. Especially on songs like Raining Blood and Angel of Death. He absolutely shows off his powerful legs on those bass drum pedals. Kills it. I honestly don't know how many drum heads he's gone through throughout his career with Slayer. He now plays for Suicidal Tendencies. So, there's that. So, number 4, Rain and Blood by Slayer from 1986. Now we're moving on to number 3. We're talking about the 1990 Megadeth album, Rust in Peace. Holy War's Punishment 2. Another great thrash metal opener. Hangar 18, really great. Of course, frickin' Tornado of Souls, one of Megadeth's most complex songs to play. Dave Mustaine sounds great on this album, as does the newcomers Marty Friedman and Nick Minza on guitar and drums respectively, and of course David Ellefson, probably at his best bass playing on this album in my opinion. There's not a dull moment on this album, and I can definitely see why a lot of people would have this as not only their favorite Megadeth album, but also one of their favorite metal albums of all time. It lands here number 3 for me, so yeah. Now we're moving on to number 2. This was so hard. So hard. It's kind of been up and down all over the place for me. But I decided to settle on number 2, Metallica's Master of Puppets from 1986. Well, so we're now getting back into 1986 here. This album is freaking amazing. I mean, for one thing, you got freaking Battery, which is amazing. And of course, the title track, my second favorite metal song of all time. My favorite song out of the Big Four. And this is definitely my favorite album from the Big Four. And basically, there's just, like with Rust in Peace, there's not a dull moment off of this album. Welcome Home Sanitarium's great. The Thing That Should Not Be is also great. And of course, freaking Orion. And even some of the more underrated tracks, like Damage Inc. is freaking killer, as is Leper Messiah, and of course, Disposable Heroes. There's really not much to complain about with Master of Puppets, but I feel like there's one album that overtakes this. And here we go. Number 1. If you've been following me on my videos, you know what number 1 is. I've said it numerous times. It's this one. Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 2 by Helloween. Now it's kind of weird that I'm wearing the shirt, and so I pretty much gave it away, but I gave it away on lots of my other videos. This is pretty much a stone cold classic, perfect album. Greatest power metal band of all time. Greatest power metal album of all time. Best album from 1988. It has my favorite metal song of all time, which is I Want Out. Has so many classics on here. Eagle Fly Free, March of Time, Rise of Fall, Dr. Stein, Keeper of the Seven Keys, and of course the aforementioned I Want Out. And Michael Kiske absolutely sounds amazing on this, as does Kai Hansen and Michael Wyckoff. Marcus Grosskopf absolutely kills it on the freaking bass. One of the most underrated bass players of all time, in my opinion. And of course, the late Ingo Schwichtenberg on the drums. Rest in peace, Ingo. Kills it on this album. There's really not much to complain about this album. It's a perfect album. So, with that all being said, Keeper of the Seven Keys, Part 2 by Helloween from the year of 1988 comes here at number 1. It was a hard-fought battle between Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 2 and Master of Puppets, but in the end I decided to go with Keepers 2. Mainly because I've been listening to a lot more Helloween than Metallica recently. This was a complicated list for me to make. Hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, my fellow YouTube divers. This is WaterEye122 signing off, ready to dive into more fun on YouTube. Thanks for watching.